Hi everybody. In this video render video, we're going to take a look at some tips for adding more realism to your D5 renders and video. I'll take a look at a sample scene that I've been working on here, and I'll discuss some of the techniques that I use to hopefully increase the realism. We'll also then at the end have a little discussion about this push and desire for realism in actual render software, especially for architectural rendering. If you're wondering what the motivation for today's video is, I actually got a comment on one of my YouTube videos, which was this, from a user whose name I've kind of blacked out, where he commented saying, "None of your renders have realism. Learn first." Which is nice. But it did get me thinking about this concept of realism, and a drive then to see how far can I push my own skill or sense of realism in these renders. And this is the scene that I created. Now, I'm going to show you the video clips that I put together into a video depicting this actual space, and I'll go ahead and play that here in a second, and then you can be the judge of whether you think it's good or not. That's fine. This is about as good as I can possibly make a D5 render or series of video clips, and I'll play that here in a second. And yeah, and then we'll talk about some of the things I did to hopefully make it look good. Let's go ahead and get into it. Everybody, so here is our testing in D5 render. Now, if we switch back to SketchUp, you can actually see this is the SketchUp modeling that we sent over to D5 render. And this brings us to the first point. If you're having a push for realism, one thing you do want to be very mindful of is the actual build and construction. Whether it's a bedroom or a bathroom or a kitchen, if you're pushing for realism, you do still need to make sure that the underlying architecture or structural builds are correct. So, for example, if you're working on a kitchen and you're building all the cabinetry, you do need to make sure that that stuff is at the right height, that it's the right depth, and there's sufficient detail. Now, bedrooms are easier because obviously most bedrooms really just feature four walls, some sort of roof or ceiling, and then maybe some sort of windows, but that's about it. But you still need to be mindful to make sure that, for example, certain things like trim, crown molding, any decorative elements, and even just making sure that, for example, your windows have a windowsill will go a long way to increasing the realism of your scenes. So, tip 1, make sure the underlying geometry is good and the modeling is hopefully realistic, scaled correctly, and proportional. The next point we want to make in a push for realism is the models themselves. Now, D5 does come with a really superb selection of pre-made models that you can just drop into your scene. And many of them are available really on the D5 free version, which is really, really fantastic. Although many are still hidden behind the paywall, but definitely worth the investment. The other thing, though, is getting really good models. So if you're looking for more variety, more options, you can always look elsewhere. Now, a lot of the models in this scene are going to come from iMesh, and I'll leave a link for those. iMesh, I think, is just without a doubt, like one of the best resources for anyone doing architectural rendering, especially for incredibly high quality models that just look absolutely superb. And it's a pretty easy workflow to load these models up from Blender and then just to save them as D5 models and import them directly into D5. And I just think they look absolutely superb. Let's bounce over here to the table. And you can see this decorative set right here is another fantastic iMesh set. For decorative elements and for furniture and chairs and tables, it's really absolutely superb. So, second point we want to make is make sure the models in your actual scene look really, really nice. And I just love the look of some of the iMesh stuff. Really, really fantastic. And you can see here the fidelity and detail is absolutely superb. And if you're going to have a detailed hero shot, the iMesh models will stand up to close scrutiny. I just think they're absolutely superb. And I'll again link out to them. But you can get away with just using the D5 models. Now, one point I do want to make is if you're going to bring in models from furniture places, say for example, the SketchUp warehouse, if you're going to use them and you're really pushing like the highest fidelity renders, you will have to replace most of the texture maps on those. So for example, this really beautiful cabinet right here did come from iMesh, but had it come from the SketchUp warehouse, I probably would have had to update all of the materials. I didn't in this situation, but just keep that in mind. Generally, almost every material should really be replaced with a D5 material if you're coming from somewhere like the SketchUp warehouse or a lot of the free libraries online. So, point of order, really, just get the best models you can. iMesh is superb, but there's lots of other great places out there too. Models will help make or break the scene. The next point we want to make pertains to smoothed edges. Now, by default, all 3D geometry, unless it's been beveled, is mathematically really sharp. Now, this is very unrealistic, and you do see this, oddly enough, in quite a lot of Twinmotion renders, because Twinmotion doesn't actually feature an edge smoothing slider. What you're doing is effectively really just telling the materials be rendered with basically a bevel. So let's take a quick look here at a scene or an object in the scene that actually requires it. So you can see we've got this really beautiful decorative element here, but if we actually zoom in a little bit closer, you can see the edges have been beveled. So how we do this in D5 is really simple. We just click on the object, move me out of the way, and go down to the round corner under the Advanced tab. Now, I suspect this is probably not something a lot of users probably even think about, but it is unbelievably important, mostly because when there's light in the scene, you can see how those edges actually look right now. And this is a lot more realistic than these really, really sharp, mathematically impossibly sharp edges that you often get with standard geometry. Now, in SketchUp, there's really only a few ways to go about beveling the edges. And so, you can build your geometry and then send it over to D5. But if you're going to have a scene element, again, for example, maybe we'll just take a quick look at this guy right here. You can again see we have used the eyedropper, sampled the material, and rounded the corner just a little bit. You can go pretty low on this, but if you're, for example, doing interiors, particularly of like bathrooms or kitchens or anywhere there's like sharpened surfaces, you're going to want to smooth those edges with the round corner slider. They'll also pick up a much nicer highlight from actual light in the scene, and so they'll just look overall better. Now, you don't have to do this on every surface, but anything that's, pointedly sharp, you probably do want to do this. The next thing I want to mention is light. If, high level of realism is your end goal, light is where you're going to spend a lot of time. Now, I'm going to take a little bit of time in this video to talk about the lighting setup. And to do that, I'm going to move myself out of the way because all of the light stuff is going to be here on the right. So let's look at the environment. First suggestion is decide if you're doing a geo and sky or HDRI lighting. Now, I am still a little bit mixed on the use of HDRIs in D5. I still do love how strong the light is with the geo and sky and how crisp the shadows are. But for this shot, we've gone for basically a pure white, let's pop outside, pure white HDRI at a pretty low light intensity. In other words, I'm not trying to exclusively light the scene from the HDRI, and that is a whole other question and discussion for D5 render, because there's a lot of people who are like, hey, I should be able to do it like in Twinmotion, light my scene with just the HDRI. But for this purposes, this all-white HDRI, which is actually available from, if we click on this, and we go to, the D5 Render Asset Library, the new version has all of these HDRIs, and down the bottom, we've got this lovely little pure white, although kind of pure gray, but whatever. It'll just basically just add white light to the scene. Now, I have also placed this at a pretty low intensity, and I've rotated and added the second sun. This is technically going to come from the hot spot or the whitest part of the image, but using the pure white HDRI, we can just rotate this, and you can see now I'm getting a little bit of light coming in. I personally do love this dappled effect, and I'll increase the sunlight intensity here, and you can really kind of see this. And we rotate, and you can kind of see that light coming in. I like this dappled look. I know a lot of people don't, and they would rather the scene be just completely magically evenly lit. That's just a personal preference for me. I will almost always add the sun if I'm doing the HDRI. Geo and sky, you just automatically tend to get these really nice sort of like dappling as light comes through the window, and you get some pretty harder shadows as well. But for this purposes, HDRI will do the job. Now, there's a couple of other things on lighting. The second is artificial lights. To my mind, this is my opinion, you do need to add artificial lights to properly light up your interior in D5. You can't really just do it with outside lighting. And this is somewhat more indicative of real life. Even in a room with the windows open, if sunlight isn't directly coming into the window, you're going to have to add some artificial lights. I mean, you can actually see it on here, right in the background of where my camera is, where my mouse is. You can see I've got little lamps on. You just need more light in the room. Now, to do this, really just take an approach of what light source looks best. For these down lamps, I've gone ahead and just placed spotlights. You just adjust the intensity, the attenuation, the cone angle, and the color. Generally, my thought would be if you've got white or blue light coming in from outside, add some warmer light to the interior lights. Just like a real-world lamp, the lighting in them tends to not be pure white. It tends to be a little bit sort of orange tinted, more warm. And you can see that over here by the desk as well. And it's pretty easy. As long as you just place the light in there, you can see it's a little bit strong in the glow here. But overall, this is casting light in a visually appealing and I think realistic manner as well. If you want to make the shot look a little bit more comfortable, I've got a little candle here, and I've used the D5 candle flames, placed that there, and I've added a really tiny little light here as well, just to give that warm glow. Now, this was a proper pain to set up. It's a really low intensity light, and you have to fiddle with the attenuation radius. It's not perfect because it doesn't flicker with the same sort of frequency that the flame actually does. But for most people, I don't know if they'd really notice that at all. Okay, now the big one is lighting outside. Now, there's probably a multitude of ways to go about doing this. I'll mention two here. I just watched a video from Nuno Silva who lit his scene using a giant plane outside on the ground, which I thought was just so very, very clever. The point is, it shoots indirect light into the scene. Now, another technique called the light wash technique is basically this. And again, this is not mine. I stole this, absolutely stole this. This is basically two of these rectangular lights put together. They are grouped. They're rotated 90 degrees. So light comes in down and light comes in upwards as well. So basically you get light going up and you get light going down. And this helps pump light into the corners of your room, so that basically the light looks a little bit more like proper diffuse soft bounce light, but you don't get the weird harsh transitions between the lit areas and the darker areas. And so you can just place that right there. Be careful it doesn't crash into the curtains too much, and then you can just slide this group into your actual room. Now you can see it's lighting up probably a little bit too much. We do also want to make sure that it's turned off. Visible and reflections, no, and show light shape, no, we turn those off. But this will basically just add a bit more diffuse light into the room. You can also see we have the barn door angle and barn door length have been tweaked as well to basically act like a funnel or light box. Now, if you're working with something quite large, for example, maybe this sort of wooden floor that we've got here, this might be the type of thing where you want to add some imperfections. So I'm going to just click on this material here, and it's a little bit hard to see, but there is a roughness map with smudges and imperfections that has been added. You can find imperfections. There's a lot of different places where you can get these type of imperfection maps or smudge maps. Sometimes they're kind of in decal form, but if the material that you're using doesn't have, for example, one that has smudges and smears and scratches and imperfections, you can always add one. I'm not a huge fan of using this on exterior buildings or exterior renders. I think it just makes buildings look a bit grimy. That's my personal preference. But I know there are some people who really like seeing like imperfections like dirt and things like that and wear and tear. It does add another layer of realism. For me, the only really times that I've used that is going to be on surfaces like the floor here. And you can kind of see, if we have light kind of bouncing around this a little bit, you can kind of see where we're getting some imperfections and smudges. So you're getting a variation in specularity, trying to basically give the impression of dirt and grime and things like that. So if you're trying to make your render look more realistic, one of the things you're going to need is stuff. Quite simply, just rooms tend to have a lot more stuff. Even if you're just looking behind me on the camera here, you can see we've got quite a lot more decorative stuff than what you would sort of normally just think if you picture a room. And even this bedroom here, we've gone to sort of a lot of lengths to add objects, books, even just this basket here with pillows in it, things like that. Small little details. Again, these iMesh models look fantastic. They come with a lot of really nice little detail. But separate to that, it's even just small things, stuff and details. Filling the room with objects and then adding in small details. Like, for me, one of my favorite things to do is add clothing draped over objects. It's just something, it's a small little thing, but people do just drop clothes on, on the floor or on the bed or just on the ottoman or whatever it is. In other words, we will just kind of place stuff in the room and we'll just kind of scatter stuff around. People expand to the space that they actually have. And when it comes to some details as well, structurally, putting in things like trim and borders, or just making sure that your windows are adequately sort of built into the actual frame, it comes back to stuff and details. So make sure there's enough objects in the scene to be viable, and make sure that the structural details are there. If you want to simplify this, do not try and build a scene or render based on your memory or just what you think a room looks like. Do it based on reference, and keep looking back at that reference and comparing the things in the scene to your actual scene. Now, if you're looking for a more realistic output, you are going to have to spend some time in D5 on the Effects tab and adjusting the post-processing and LUT effects. So let's just talk really quickly about these. Exposure, you generally want to manually adjust the exposure for all of your work in D5. Like, turn off the auto exposure. It's nice to have it as you move inside and outside, but when you're actually ready to render, turn off the auto exposure and you set that. You can use the highlight and shadow local exposure to adjust whether the image is excessively too bright or to lighten or darken shadows in certain areas. But that's very much a fine-tuning type of thing, but you should definitely do that as well. Contrast, I don't necessarily recommend working with the contrast. If you're going to do this, I would rather do it in Photoshop for a still image, or actually using your video editing software if you're going to adjust it. I've almost never found that I needed to go in there and adjust the contrast. Highlight, shadow, and slope, this is a purely a personal preference and image-based decision. You can go in there and maybe take down the highlights a little bit. Slope, I've generally just left at 0.8 and never really messed with it that much. Now, other things that will matter for you, bloom and lens flare. Strictly speaking, lens flare, yeah, it might look really nice for exterior shots. I just turned it off for this render. I don't want any lens flare because I don't really feel like it's realistic. Bloom, I generally have just left this on. I think it just looks nice. You get a little dash of it over metal objects, but other than that, don't worry about it. Now, chromatic aberration, you can put this on, but less is more for this one. Chromatic aberration is effectively almost a photographic effect, mimicking the distortion you got with traditional cameras. It can be very strong, and it kind of makes people feel uncomfortable and a little bit nauseous. So basically, yeah, less is more on the chromatic aberration. It does add a little bit of realism because it, sort of does mimic how we think footage should look, because it's slightly not quite as real. Sort of like the imperfections sell it a little bit, kind of like adding a little bit of noise and grain to your render as well. But seriously, chromatic aberration, less is more. Ambient occlusion, yes. So AO, best way I can kind of, sort of explain this, it's adding back the occlusion you get in shadows. In other words, the darkening in and around shadows. Now, you can toggle this guy on, and you can toggle this off. And you can also turn on the ambient occlusion overlay in preview, and then adjust the actual radius. So you can kind of see here, we're adjusting basically the darkness of those shadows. And I think that looks really, really nice. And then you can also turn on the AO overlay in preview and give you an idea of how it's going to look. Really nice to be able to add shadow depth back into your scene. But again, there's no magic number for some of these settings. You're just going to have to go in and really make a visual assessment each time you work with them. But those will help quite a bit. When it comes to setting up your video clips and your renders, please be also mindful of focal length. By adjusting the focal length here, you can actually affect how sort of in the shot you sort of tend to feel. So you can see as we raise this up a little bit, it really brings you into the scene. This will have to be set on a per image basis as well, but it will also be set on a clip basis. So keep that in mind as well. My general preference is for moving to use ease in and ease out, and I keep the aspect ratio at 16:9, more resembling sort of a standard monitor, but that's absolutely sort of depends on what the outcome is. For videos giving to clients, I just leave it as 16:9. And the focal length, generally for interiors, 30 plus is my recommendation. But if you really want to get up close and personal with something in the shot, maybe it's a picture of a family member or something like that, something that you're trying to sell the emotional component to a client, then I would go even further. I'd take that camera up a little bit higher as well. Now, when it comes to doing video, my suggestion is to render out multiple clips. And you can see we've got all of our different clips here together, stitch them together in another software. I don't necessarily recommend trying to push one big sweeping panorama. I don't think that looks really good. Try and avoid jagged camera movements, and try and avoid, sort of putting excessive amount of movement in your shots as well. It's almost like kind of show, don't tell. Like, it's nice to have camera pans and maybe have very subtle camera movements, just kind of small little things like this, but don't try and do large tracking shots in your scene. That would be my suggestion. Now, the other thing I do want to mention on this when it comes to video realism, I am a big fan of depth of field. I think it looks really, really good, and I think you can get some beautiful transitions, especially as a camera just moves around objects, or as one object goes into and out of focus. So you can see here, just like this. It's a nice technique that sort of brings the viewer into the shot. Having everything in focus all the time is also a little harder for the eye to figure out where it's supposed to go. Now, you can take this a bit too far, and where it's like very sort of like movie kind of level where it's just too much depth of field. But for subtle camera transitions, it can really help quite a lot. Hopefully some of these little tips and tricks you found a little bit useful, and thank you so much for watching. Like I said at the start, this is as realistic as I can make interior renders in D5, and hopefully you found this useful. I'm sure there's a lot of other tips and techniques out there for making things look more realistic, but that also then brings the question of why we're pushing realism so much. Now, the point I want to make on this is realistic renders are great. They're visually appealing. They look cool. They look high fidelity. It, however, doesn't necessarily always mean that they're the best. If you've looked at any Lumion render, particularly, before the ray tracing came in, Lumion was not a photorealistic rendering engine. It didn't feature ray tracing or path tracing, and yet nobody would doubt that the highest level Lumion renders looked stunning, and they still, even in the raster mode, look stunning. So realism is nice to have, but it's not necessarily the only end goal. An example, some people might find more artistic rendering to look a lot more appealing. Some also tend to prefer renders that have more of an ethereal or dreamlike quality. Example of this would be Haze Visuals from the UK, who make really the most sublime, dreamy, ethereal, and yet warm renders that I've ever seen. They're just incredible. That's Haze Visuals, I think, .com. Really amazing work, but it's not photorealistic. Now, the other point also I want to mention on this is going back to something that Show It Better mentioned in one of their previous videos. Again, really, really great content. And that is, without an emotional component to your renders, no matter how realistic you make them, they still will just kind of look cold. You either tell the story or you have an emotional connection in the scene. I referenced, for example, having a photo of a family member, or maybe it's a piece of artwork that the client or family that you're working for really likes the look of. You put that in the render, and that gives them an emotional hook. You're basically trying to elicit an emotional reaction more than you are just trying to show off, oh, look how hyper-realistic my caustic reflections of water in a glass is. That's great, but without the emotional connection, I still think it just falls flat. Quite simply, photorealism, hyperrealism, using V-Ray or Corona or the highest level of D5 or whatever it is, or the Path Tracer and Lumion, they're all well and good, and you can get some stunning images, but they might not be images that make you feel anything or that you feel any connection to. They might look technically impressive, but I don't know if that's enough, honestly. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and leave it there. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully these tips helped a little bit if your goal is more realism, and there's nothing wrong with that. All right. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.